The gunshot that shattered the evening stillness sent birds scattering from the cottonwood trees along the creek, their wings flapping desperately against the crimson sky as Harriet Foster ducked behind a fallen log, clutching her meager belongings to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she peered over the rough bark, squinting through the gathering darkness at the distant figures on horseback. They were still coming, 3 men, silhouettes against the sunset, tracking her like wolves after wounded prey. Harriet had been running for 2 days now, ever since slipping out the back window of her uncle's house in the dead of night. 2 days of hiding in ditches when riders passed, of drinking from streams and sleeping in patches of tall grass, jumping at every sound. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins, and her once fine blue dress was now stained with dirt and sweat. The year was 1875, and for a 20-year-old woman alone in the Wyoming Territory, the world was a dangerous place. She knew what would happen if they caught her. Uncle Jeremiah had been explicit about the consequences of refusing to marry Mr. Donovan, his business partner, a man 3 times her age with cold eyes and hands that wandered. A man who had offered to forgive her uncle's substantial debts in exchange for Harriet's hand. "There you are," a rough voice called, much closer than she expected. Harriet bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. The riders had split up. One of them had circled around and was now dismounting barely 20 yards away. She clutched the small kitchen knife she'd stolen from her uncle's house, knowing it would do little good against a man with a gun, but unwilling to be taken without a fight. She crouched lower, praying the growing darkness would hide her. But the crunch of boots on dry leaves came steadily closer. "Miss Foster," the man called, his voice a low drawl that sent shivers down her spine. "Your uncle's mighty worried about you. Be a good girl now and come on out." Harriet knew it for the lie it was. Jeremiah Foster wasn't worried, he was furious. She'd embarrassed him by running, and the price for that would be steep. The footsteps drew nearer and she tensed, ready to run. The crack of a rifle shot split the air, followed by another. The man tracking her cursed and ducked. From somewhere in the darkness came the thunder of hooves, and a voice called out, "Chapman, Jenkins, mount up and clear out." "Who's there?" Her pursuer shouted, drawing his pistol. Another shot rang out, splintering bark from a tree near the man's head. He fired blindly into the darkness, then turned and ran for his horse. Harriet remained frozen, listening to the sound of retreating hoofbeats. Had someone else come for her, or was this merely a different danger? Minutes passed in silence. The night birds began to call again. Slowly, she rose to a crouch, preparing to slip away. "They're gone now, madam." The voice came from directly behind her. Harriet whirled, brandishing her small knife, and found herself facing the broad chest of a tall man. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the log. "Easy now," he said, raising his hands to show they were empty. "I'm not with them." In the fading light, she could make out a weather-beaten face beneath the brim of a dusty hat. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and there was a star-shaped badge pinned to his chest. "Who are you?" Harriet demanded, keeping the knife between them. "Name's Everett Holt, Deputy U.S. Marshal," he gestured to the badge. "And you'd be Harriet Foster, I reckon." Her eyes widened. "How do you 3 men tearing across the territory chasing a lone woman tends to draw attention?" "Station master in Cottonwood Springs mentioned your uncle was offering a reward for your safe return." His expression remained neutral, but his eyes were kind. "Didn't mention why you might have run, though." Harriet swallowed hard. "Are you taking me back?" Marshal Holt studied her for a long moment. "That depends. Did you break any laws I should know about?" "No, I just—" She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "You just don't want to marry whoever your uncle picked out," he finished for her. Harriet's shoulders sagged. "Mr. Donovan is 53 years old. He's already buried 2 wives. The marshal nodded slowly. "Well, last I checked, refusing marriage isn't a crime in Wyoming Territory." He glanced in the direction the riders had gone. "But those men aren't likely to give up. Where were you headed?" "My cousin lives in Denver," Harriet said. "I thought if I could reach her." "Denver's still a good 100 miles south," Holt said, "and there's rough country between here and there." Night had fallen completely now, and a chill wind whispered through the trees. Harriet shivered, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. "My cabin's about a mile west of here," the marshal said. "You'd be safe there tonight. We can figure out the rest in the morning." Harriet hesitated, gripping her knife tighter. How do I know I can trust you? A faint smile crossed his face. You don't, but those men will be back with more help by morning and you look ready to drop where you stand. He gestured toward the darkness. Your choice, Miss Foster, stay out here alone or take a chance on my hospitality. Harriet weighed her options. She was exhausted, hungry, and had no real plan beyond running, and there had been something in the way he'd said your choice as if he truly meant it. All right, she said finally, but I'm keeping this. She indicated the knife. Marshal Holt nodded. Fair enough. He whistled softly, and a moment later, a large black horse emerged from the shadows. This is Midnight. He doesn't much care for strangers, but he'll carry us both to the cabin. Harriet eyed the massive animal warily as Holt checked his saddle. You ever ride astride, Miss Foster? She shook her head. Ladies rode side saddle when they rode at all. Well, tonight's your first lesson then, he offered his hand. May I? After a moment's hesitation, Harriet took it, allowing him to help her mount. The horse shifted beneath her and she clutched at the saddle horn. Easy now, Holt murmured, and Harriet wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or the horse. He swung up behind her with practiced grace, leaving a respectful distance between them. Hold on to the saddle. Midnight knows the way home. As they set off through the darkness, Harriet found herself acutely aware of the marshal's presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the occasional brush of his arm against hers as he guided the horse through the trees. Despite her exhaustion and fear, there was something reassuring about his quiet competence. The cabin appeared suddenly out of the darkness, a solid structure of logs and stone with a small porch and chimney. A metal star hanging beside the door caught the moonlight and gleamed softly. Marshal Holt dismounted first, then helped Harriet down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Wait here while I check inside, he said, drawing his revolver. He approached the cabin cautiously, disappearing through the door. A moment later, a lantern flared to life, casting a warm glow through the windows. Holt reappeared on the porch. All clear. Harriet followed him inside, blinking in the sudden light. The cabin was simple but neat: a table and chairs, a stone fireplace with cooking implements, a chest of drawers, and a narrow bed against the far wall. A rifle stood in one corner, and wanted posters were tacked to the wall beside a bookshelf filled with an unexpected number of volumes. It's not much, Holt said, but it's dry and defensible. Harriet realized she was still clutching her small bundle of possessions to her chest. It's fine, she said. Thank you. I need to see to Midnight, he said. Make yourself comfortable. There's coffee in the tin by the stove if you've a mind to make some. After he'd gone, Harriet stood uncertainly in the middle of the room. Her gaze fell on a framed photograph on the bookshelf, a woman with a serious expression, her hair pulled back severely. Beside it was a small wooden carving of a horse, expertly crafted. She moved closer, curiosity momentarily overcoming her caution. My sister, Holt said from the doorway, startling her. She lives in St. Louis with her husband. I'm sorry, Harriet said, stepping away from the shelf. I didn't mean to pry. He shrugged, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. His hair was a deep brown, streaked with gray at the temples, despite him not appearing much older than 30. Not much privacy in a one-room cabin. Harriet's stomach chose that moment to growl loudly, reminding her that she'd had nothing to eat since the previous evening. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. When's the last time you ate? Holt asked, already moving toward a cupboard. Yesterday, she admitted. I had some bread, but it's gone now. He nodded, pulling out a sack of cornmeal and some dried meat. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage something. Harriet watched as he moved around the small space, his actions efficient but graceless. When he knocked over the salt cellar while trying to light the stove, she stepped forward. I can cook, mister, she whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. Marshal Holt turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming his stern features into something altogether more approachable. You don't have to, he said, but you can stay. He gestured toward the stove. Might be nice to eat something that doesn't taste like saddle leather for a change. Harriet smiled back, the first genuine smile in what felt like forever. I can't promise anything fancy with cornmeal and jerky, but I'll do my best. As she moved toward the stove, the knife still tucked into her pocket, she felt something inside her begin to unwind. She wasn't safe, not truly, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. Marshall Holt watched her for a moment, then turned away to stoke the fire. "I'll make some coffee," he said. "And then maybe you can tell me the whole story about why your uncle's so set on marrying you off to this Donovan fellow." Harriet nodded, already mixing cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt. "It's not a pleasant tale. Few are out here," he replied. "But knowing the full measure of trouble helps me figure out how to address it." As they worked side by side in the small cabin, with the wind whistling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, Harriet found herself wondering if perhaps she had found an unexpected ally in this quiet lawman with the kind eyes. By the time the simple meal was ready, cornmeal cakes with bits of rehydrated jerky mixed in, and strong black coffee, Harriet had told Marshall Holt the entire story. How her parents had died of fever 3 years ago, leaving her in the care of her father's brother. How Uncle Jeremiah had at first seemed kind, but gradually revealed himself to be a gambler and a drunk who viewed her as a burden. How he'd lost increasingly large sums to Edgar Donovan, who had eventually suggested wiping the slate clean in exchange for Harriet's hand in marriage. "The day I left, I overheard them discussing it," she said, staring into her coffee cup. "Donovan said he'd always admired my figure, and that Uncle Jeremiah was getting the better end of the bargain." Holt's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, allowing her to continue. "Uncle announced the engagement at dinner that night, said the wedding would be in 3 days' time." She looked up, meeting the marshal's eyes. "I couldn't do it, so I waited until they were asleep, took what little money I could find, and left." "And now they're hunting you," Holt said, his voice flat. Harriet nodded. "Donovan won't want to lose face, and Uncle Jeremiah, he doesn't like being defied." 3 days' ride from here to Denver if the weather holds," Holt said thoughtfully, "but they'll be watching the roads and trails." He drummed his fingers on the table. "Your cousin, will she take you in, Margaret?" "Yes, she wrote to me after my parents died, offering a home, but Uncle Jeremiah intercepted the letter." Harriet twisted her hands in her lap. "I found it when I was cleaning his study." "She said I would always have a place with her family if I needed it." Holt nodded slowly. "First light tomorrow, we'll head south, but not straight for Denver. We'll cut west toward the mountains, then approach from a direction they won't expect." Harriet blinked in surprise. "We. You think I'm going to let you ride into that country alone?" He raised an eyebrow. "Those men aren't just going to give up and go home, Miss Foster." "But what about your duties as marshal?" He gestured toward the wanted posters on the wall. "Currently tracking a gang that's been robbing stagecoaches between here and Cheyenne. Last report had them heading south." A faint smile crossed his face. "Which, coincidentally, is the direction we'll be traveling." Harriet hesitated. "I can't pay you. Did I ask for payment?" His expression softened slightly. "Look, I became a lawman to protect people. Sometimes that means hunting down outlaws. Sometimes it means making sure a young woman isn't forced into marriage against her will. You truly believe a woman should have that choice?" "Wyoming's been letting women vote for 5 years now," Holt replied. "Seems to me choosing who to marry is at least as important as choosing who makes the laws." Harriet studied him, trying to reconcile this man with her experience of the other men in her life, her uncle with his casual cruelty, Donovan with his greedy eyes, even her father, who, though kind, had always treated her as something delicate and not quite capable. "Thank you," she said finally. He nodded once, then rose to clear the plates. "You take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly. You could and you will," he said firmly. "You've been sleeping rough for 2 days. I do it regularly." Too exhausted to argue further, Harriet accepted the arrangement. As she settled onto the narrow bed, pulling the rough woolen blanket around her shoulders, she found herself studying Marshall Holt's profile as he sat cleaning his revolver by the fire. There was a steadiness to him that she found deeply reassuring. Despite her fears, sleep claimed her quickly. Harriet woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of low voices. For a moment, panic seized her had they been found, but then she recognized Marshall Holt's deep tones. She sat up, pushing her tangled hair from her face. Holt was standing by the door speaking with an older man in a battered hat. They both turned at her movement. "Miss Foster," Holt said, "this is Tom Black Elk. He brings news." The older man nodded respectfully to her. His weathered face spoke of years in the sun, and his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen much of life's hardships. "The men who chase you have hired more hunters," Black Elk said without preamble. 6 riders were asking questions in Cottonwood Springs at dawn. They offer $50 to anyone who brings information about a blonde woman traveling alone. Harriet's blood ran cold. $50 was more than most ranch hands made in a month. Thank you for the warning, Holt said, pressing something into the older man's hand. You've risked enough coming here. Black Elk pocketed whatever Holt had given him. I owed you, he said simply. Now we are even. He glanced at Harriet. The woman should change her appearance. They describe her too well. After he had gone, Harriet turned to Holt. How did he know where to find you? Tom's Arapaho knows these hills better than anyone. We've helped each other out over the years. Holt handed her a cup of coffee. He's right about changing your appearance. Your uncle's description is too accurate. Harriet touched her long, blonde hair self-consciously. What do you suggest? Holt looked uncomfortable for the first time since she'd met him. Well, cutting your hair would be the most effective change, but it wouldn't be proper, she finished for him. He nodded. There are other options, dye perhaps, or a hat in different clothes. Harriet considered for a moment, then set down her coffee cup with determination. Do you have scissors? Holt's eyebrows rose. Miss Foster, Harriet, she interrupted. If we're going to be traveling together, you might as well use my given name. A brief smile touched his lips. Harriet then, and I'm Everett to my friends, he paused. Are you certain about your hair? It's quite beautiful. The unexpected compliment brought warmth to her cheeks. It's just hair, she said, though part of her mourned the impending loss. It will grow back. My freedom is worth more. Everett nodded slowly. I have shears in that drawer, he said, pointing. Used for trimming Midnight's mane sometimes. Harriet retrieved them, feeling their weight in her hands. Would you help me? I can't see the back. Uncertainty flickered across his face. I've never cut a lady's hair before. Well, I've never cut my own, so we're evenly matched. She handed him the shears and sat down on the room's only chair. Nothing fancy, just short enough that I might pass for a boy at a distance. Everett circled her, frowning. Are you certain? In answer, Harriet reached up and pulled out the remaining pins, letting her hair fall loose down her back. It had been her pride once, thick and golden and reaching her waist. Now it felt like a beacon announcing her presence to her pursuers. I'm certain, she said. With obvious reluctance, Everett gathered her hair in one hand. The first snip of the shears made a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. Harriet closed her eyes, feeling the weight disappear as lock after lock of her hair fell to the floor around her. Almost done, Everett murmured, his fingers gentle against her neck as he trimmed the back. The touch sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. Finally, he stepped back. There, he said, his voice rough. It's done. Harriet raised a hand to her head, feeling the strange lightness. Her hair now barely reached her jawline. How does it look? Everett cleared his throat. Different, he said, but not bad at all. She smiled at his obvious attempt to be kind. Is there a mirror above the washstand? Harriet crossed to the small mirror and stared at her reflection. The woman who looked back was a stranger, younger somehow, with her features more prominent without the frame of long hair. The short locks curled slightly around her face. I look like a completely different person, she said with wonder. That's the idea, Everett replied, sweeping her discarded hair into the fireplace. But we'll need to find you different clothes too. Those men will be looking for a woman in a blue dress. Harriet glanced down at her dirty, torn garment. I don't suppose you have women's clothing tucked away somewhere, he shook his head, but I have spare shirts and trousers that might do with some adjustments. He crossed to a trunk at the foot of the bed and began rummaging through it. We should leave soon. Tom's warning gives us a head start, but they'll widen their search when they find no trace of you on the main roads. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Harriet had used her sewing skills to quickly take in a pair of Everett's old trousers and adjust a faded red shirt. With her hair cut short and wearing men's clothing, she looked like a slender youth. A battered hat Everett had found completed the disguise. How do I look? She asked, turning in a circle. Everett studied her with an unreadable expression. Like someone nobody would look twice at, he said finally. Which is exactly what we want. He had packed supplies for several days: jerky, cornmeal, coffee, and ammunition. A bedroll was tied behind Midnight's saddle, and a second horse, a sturdy chestnut mare Everett called Penny, stood ready for Harriet. Can you ride? He asked as he adjusted Penny's stirrups to accommodate Harriet's shorter legs. Side saddle a little, she admitted. Nothing like this. Penny's gentle, he assured her. She'll follow Midnight's lead. Just hold the reins loose and keep your weight centered. Harriet nodded, trying to hide her nervousness. The mare was nowhere near as imposing as Midnight, but she was still a large animal. One more thing, Everett said, handing her a small revolver. It's loaded, 5 shots. Harriet took the weapon gingerly. I've never fired a gun. Hopefully you won't need to, he said, but if we get separated, point it at the center of whoever's threatening you and pull the trigger. At close range, you won't miss. The weight of the revolver in her hand made their situation suddenly more real. These weren't just men looking to bring her home, they were hunters who might not care if she returned alive, as long as they eliminated the embarrassment she represented. With Everett's help, she mounted Penny, adjusting to the strange feeling of sitting astride. He showed her how to hold the reins, then swung up onto Midnight with practiced ease. Ready? He asked. Harriet nodded, squaring her shoulders. Ready. They rode west from the cabin, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The day was clear and cool, with high clouds drifting across the blue sky. Under different circumstances, Harriet might have enjoyed the scenery, the majestic mountains rising to the west, the golden leaves of the aspens shimmering in the breeze. Everett set a steady pace, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was managing. Harriet found that riding astride was easier than she'd expected, though her muscles soon began to protest the unfamiliar activity. We'll stop at midday, Everett called over his shoulder. Give the horses a rest. As they rode, Harriet found herself studying her companion. In the daylight, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, laugh lines, though he didn't seem to smile often. His profile was strong, with a straight nose and firm jaw shadowed with a day's growth of beard. There was a small scar above his right eyebrow, and his hands, when not holding the reins, moved with a kind of contained grace. How long have you been a marshal? She asked when they paused at a stream to water the horses. 5 years, he replied, scanning the horizon as he spoke. Army before that, cavalry. The war, he nodded. Enlisted at 17, saw the end of it. His expression closed, suggesting he didn't wish to discuss it further. And your family, besides your sister in St. Louis, parents are gone. Father was a blacksmith in Illinois. Mother died when I was 14, father a few years later. He glanced at her. What about you? Besides your uncle and cousin? No one, Harriet said. My mother had a brother in Boston, but we lost touch after he moved west. He might not even be alive anymore. Everett nodded, understanding in his eyes. Loss was a common thread in the territory's disease. Accidents and violence claimed many lives, leaving scattered survivors to forge new connections or live in isolation. They continued their journey, skirting wide around small settlements and ranches. Twice they spotted riders in the distance and detoured into stands of trees until the potential threat had passed. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered, bringing a chill to the air. Rain coming, Everett said, eyeing the sky. We need to find shelter before it hits. Harriet nodded, her legs and back aching from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. How much further today? There's an old line shack about an hour's ride from here, he replied. Used by cattle outfits during roundup, should be empty this time of year. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as they approached the shack, a crude one-room structure of rough-hewn logs with a sagging porch. Everett dismounted to check inside while Harriet waited with the horses, rain soaking through her borrowed shirt. Clear, he called from the doorway. Bring the horses around back. There's a lean-to we can shelter them under. The interior of the shack was dusty but dry, with a small fireplace, a rickety table, and a pair of wooden bunks built into the wall. Everett quickly got a fire going while Harriet shook out the thin mattresses, raising clouds of dust. Not exactly the Palmer House Hotel, Everett said with a wry smile, but it'll keep us dry. Outside, the rain increased, drumming on the roof and streaming past the single small window. Harriet sat on one of the bunks, massaging her sore legs. First day's the hardest, Everett said, noticing her discomfort. You'll toughen up. I'm beginning to understand why ladies are encouraged to travel by coach, she replied, attempting humor despite her exhaustion. Everett chuckled, the sound warming the dreary space. When I was in the cavalry, new recruits would sometimes cry after their first full day in the saddle, "You're doing better than most of them." The unexpected compliment brought a smile to Harriet's face. Thank you. Though I suspect I'll pay for it tomorrow. Probably, he agreed, turning his attention to their supplies. Hungry, they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, washed down with coffee. The rain continued unabated and the temperature dropped further as night fell. Harriet shivered, her damp clothes clinging uncomfortably. "You should change," Everett said, rummaging in his saddlebags. "I have a spare shirt. It'll be too big, but it's dry." He handed her a faded blue flannel shirt, then turned his back to give her privacy. Harriet quickly stripped off her wet outer clothing, keeping on the thin chemise she wore underneath, and pulled on Everett's shirt. It hung almost to her knees, the sleeves extending well past her fingertips. "You can turn around now," she said, rolling up the sleeves. Everett glanced at her and something flickered in his eyes before he quickly looked away. "We should get some sleep. Long ride tomorrow." As he banked the fire for the night, Harriet settled onto one of the bunks, pulling the rough blanket around her. Despite the hard mattress and the sound of rain pounding on the roof, exhaustion soon pulled her toward sleep. She was drifting off when a sound outside jerked her fully awake, the distinctive whinny of a horse, and not one of theirs. Everett was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand. He pressed a finger to his lips, then moved silently to the window, keeping to the side to avoid being silhouetted against the faint firelight. Harriet's heart pounded as she reached for the small revolver he'd given her. Had they been found already? Long moments passed. The only sounds were the rain and the occasional creak of the old shack as the wind gusted against it. Finally, Everett relaxed slightly. "Probably just a stray," he murmured, "or a wild Mustang seeking shelter from the storm." But he kept his revolver close as he stretched out on the other bunk, and Harriet noticed that he positioned himself between her and the door. "Try to sleep," he said softly. "I'm a light sleeper. Nothing's getting past me." Despite her fear, there was something profoundly comforting about his presence, this man who had, without hesitation, risked himself to help a stranger. As she drifted toward sleep, Harriet realized that for the first time since her parents' death, she felt truly protected. Morning brought clearing skies and a world washed clean by the night's rain. No sign remained of whatever had caused the horse's whinny, and Everett declared it safe to continue their journey after a careful reconnaissance of the area around the shack. "We'll follow Beaver Creek today," he said as they saddled the horses. "It eventually joins with the South Platte, which will take us toward Denver, but we'll cut away before we reach any of the larger settlements." Harriet nodded, trying not to wince as she mounted Penny. Her muscles protested vigorously after yesterday's ride. "Sore?" Everett asked, noticing her discomfort. "I'll manage," she replied, determined not to slow them down. He studied her for a moment, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin. "Liniment," he explained. "Rub it on tonight. It helps." The day passed uneventfully as they followed the winding creek. Harriet found herself gradually relaxing into the rhythm of travel, even beginning to appreciate the rugged beauty of the landscape. Everett proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of information about the territory. "See those bluffs to the west," he said during their midday rest. "Local Cheyenne believe they're the backs of great buffalo who turned to stone when the first white men arrived." "Is that true?" Harriet asked, shading her eyes to look. Everett shrugged. "True or not, they're a good navigation point. You can see them for miles in clear weather." As the afternoon wore on, they began to encounter more signs of human presence, the occasional distant ranch house, herds of cattle grazing on the open grassland. Everett grew more vigilant, frequently studying the horizon with a small brass spyglass. "What are you looking for?" Harriet asked after the third such pause. "Dust," he replied. "Large groups of riders kick it up, so do cattle drives. Either could be a problem for us." He collapsed the spyglass. "So far, so good." They made camp that evening in a sheltered hollow near the creek, concealed from casual observation by a stand of cottonwoods. Everett built a small fire, keeping it low to minimize smoke, while Harriet unsaddled Penny under his guidance. "You're a quick learner," he observed as she correctly loosened the cinch. "I've always had to be," Harriet replied. At his questioning look, she elaborated. "My father believed education was important even for girls. But after he died, Uncle Jeremiah made it clear that my only value lay in the marriage I could make." She stroked Penny's neck, finding comfort in the animal's solid presence. "I learned to observe and adapt." Everett nodded, his expression thoughtful. Adaptation is how we survive out here. As they settled around the small fire with their meager supper, Harriet found herself wondering about the man across from her. What experiences had shaped him? What dreams or regrets did he carry? "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured. Everett looked up from his coffee, wariness in his eyes. "You can ask. The photograph in your cabin, your sister, you said, but there was something in the way you looked at it." Harriet hesitated. Was there someone else, someone you cared for a moment? She thought he wouldn't answer. His face had gone very still, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "There was," he said finally. "Her name was Catherine. We were to be married after the war." "What happened?" Harriet asked softly. "Cholera," he replied, his voice flat. "Swept through her town while I was still serving. By the time I got the news and made it back, she'd been in the ground 2 weeks." "I'm so sorry," Harriet said, aching for the pain she saw in his eyes. Everett shrugged, but the casualness of the gesture was belied by the tension in his shoulders. "It was a long time ago, 8 years. "Is that why you became a marshal? After losing her?" He considered the question, staring into the fire. "Partly," he admitted. "Couldn't see the point in settling down anymore. Figured I might as well put my skills to use." He glanced up at her. "The war taught me how to track, how to shoot, how to survive. Being a marshal seemed a natural fit. And does it satisfy you, this life?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Asking the big questions tonight, aren't you?" Harriet flushed. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to pry." "No, it's a fair question." He set his coffee cup aside. "There are days when it does, when I bring in someone who's hurt others and know they'll face justice, when I help someone who needs it." His eyes met hers across the fire. "Other days, I wonder what it might have been like to have a home, children. Someone waiting for me to return." The raw honesty of his answer caught Harriet off guard. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine Everett Holt coming home to someone who loved him, hanging his hat by the door, bending to embrace a child, sharing the simple intimacy of a meal with a wife who valued him. The image stirred something unexpected within her. "It's not too late," she said quietly, "for those things." Everett held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he looked away, reaching for a stick to poke at the fire. "We should get some rest," he said. "Dawn comes early." As Harriet settled into her bedroll that night, staring up at stars brilliant in the clear sky, she found herself thinking about choices. Her uncle had tried to rob her of hers. Everett had lost his through tragedy. Yet here they both were, on a journey neither had anticipated, their paths unexpectedly intertwined. She wondered where those paths might lead when they reached Denver. The next day brought a complication. As they crested a low hill around midday, Everett abruptly raised his hand, signaling Harriet to halt. He pulled out his spyglass and studied something in the distance. "Problem?" Harriet asked, guiding Penny alongside Midnight. "Cattle Drive," Everett replied, still looking through the glass. "Moving south across our path, at least 1,000 head from what I can see." "Is that bad?" He lowered the spyglass, his expression grim. "It means cowboys, a dozen or more, and cowboys talk to each other, share news about anything unusual they've seen." Harriet understood immediately. "Like a U.S. Marshal traveling with a young man who might look like a woman in disguise." "Exactly." Everett tucked the spyglass away. "We have two options: wait for them to pass, which could take a day or more, or circle far around to the west." "The west would take us into the foothills," Harriet observed, looking toward the mountains that had been their constant companions on the horizon. "Rougher country," Everett agreed. "Slower going, but less chance of running into people." "What do you think we should do?" He studied her face. "How are you holding up, truthfully?" Harriet considered. Her muscles ached from 2 days of riding and the pace had been taxing, but the thought of delaying their journey, of increasing the risk of discovery, was worse. "I can manage the foothills," she said with more confidence than she felt. Everett nodded, something like approval in his eyes. "Foothills it is." They altered their course, moving west toward the rugged terrain that marked the beginning of the Rocky Mountains. By late afternoon, they were climbing steadily, the horses picking their way along game trails that wound through increasingly dense forest. The air grew cooler as they ascended, carrying the scent of pine and the faint musk of wild animals. Harriet found herself enchanted despite her fatigue. She had grown up in towns and cities, and the raw beauty of the wilderness stirred something primal within her. "It's beautiful," she said as they paused to rest the horses beside a tumbling mountain stream. Everett, kneeling to fill their canteens, glanced up at her with surprise. Most people just see the danger in country like this. Oh, I see that too, Harriet replied, eyeing the steep slope they had just climbed. But there's something honest about it. The land doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. A slow smile spread across Everett's face, the most genuine she had seen from him. That's a good way of putting it, he said. Honest. He stood, handing her a filled canteen. We'll make camp soon. There's a small plateau about a mile ahead that I've used before. As they continued their climb, Harriet found herself watching Everett with new interest. There was a subtle change in him since they'd entered the mountains, a slight easing of the vigilance he maintained in more populated areas. Here, in the wilderness, he seemed more at home. The plateau he had mentioned turned out to be a small clearing on a relatively flat area, sheltered by towering pines and offering a breathtaking view of the valley below. A circle of stones indicated a previous campfire, and a crude lean-to of branches stood against one side. You've camped here before, Harriet observed as they dismounted. Everett nodded, already untying his bedroll. It's a good spot, defensible with water nearby. He gestured toward a faint path leading away from the clearing. There's a spring about 50 yards in that direction. They worked together to establish camp, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised Harriet. She gathered firewood while Everett tended to the horses, then helped him prepare a simple meal. By the time darkness fell, they were seated comfortably by a small fire, the vast panorama of stars overhead. How much further to Denver? Harriet asked, sipping the hot coffee that had become a welcome ritual. 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the weather and the route we take. Everett studied the flames. We'll need to descend back to lower elevations tomorrow. Too rough to continue through the mountains all the way. Harriet nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions at the thought of reaching their destination. Relief, certainly her cousin would welcome her and she would be beyond her uncle's reach, but also a strange reluctance. These days on the trail with Everett had awakened something in her, a sense of freedom, of possibility that she had never experienced before. What will you do? She asked. After you've delivered me safely to Margaret's. Everett glanced up, surprise evident in his expression. Continue tracking the stagecoach robbers, I suppose. That's still my assignment. And then back to your cabin, he nodded. Eventually, there's always work for a marshal in these territories. Harriet tried to imagine returning to a conventional life after these days of adventure, wearing proper dresses again, observing social niceties, perhaps eventually marrying some respectable Denver businessman. The thought left her strangely hollow. What about you? Everett asked, breaking into her thoughts. What will you do in Denver? I'm not sure, she admitted. Find work, perhaps. I can sew quite well, and I've had some education. She traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. Margaret will help me, I'm certain. You could teach, Everett suggested. Towns are always looking for school teachers. Harriet smiled at the thought. Perhaps. I do love books and learning. They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire crackled between them. The night was peaceful, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or distant cry of a coyote to break the stillness. Look, Everett said suddenly, pointing upward. Shooting star. Harriet tilted her head back just in time to see a streak of light arc across the heavens. Make a wish, she said without thinking. Did you? She nodded, though she kept her wish to herself, a fragile, half-formed thing she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Later, as she lay in her bedroll listening to Everett's steady breathing from a few feet away, Harriet found herself contemplating the strange turns her life had taken. 2 weeks ago, she had been a virtual prisoner in her uncle's house, facing a future she dreaded. Now she was sleeping under the stars, dressed as a boy, in the company of a man who treated her with more respect than any she had known since her father. A man who, she was beginning to realize, had awakened feelings she had never experienced before. Morning came with a magnificent sunrise that painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose. Harriet woke to find Everett already up, tending the horses. He nodded a greeting as she emerged from her bedroll, his expression unreadable in the early light. Sleep well. He asked, tightening Midnight's cinch. Better than I expected, she replied, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. The air is different up here, cleaner somehow. Everett nodded. Less time for man to spoil it. They broke camp efficiently and began their descent, following a different trail than the one they had climbed. The going was steeper in places, requiring their full attention to navigate safely. By midday, they had reached lower elevations where aspen and cottonwood replaced the towering pines of the higher slopes. "We'll cross the South Platte tomorrow," Everett said as they paused to rest the horses. "From there, it's about a day and a half to Denver if we push it." Harriet nodded, trying to ignore the pang she felt at the thought of their journey ending. "You've been very kind, Everett," she said suddenly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." He looked uncomfortable at her gratitude. "No need for repayment, just doing my job." "Is it really?" "Your job to escort runaway brides across the territory," a faint smile touched his lips. "Well, maybe not officially, but protecting citizens falls under my jurisdiction." "Still," Harriet insisted, "I am grateful. Not many men would have helped as you have." Everett shrugged, clearly uneasy with her praise. "We should keep moving. I'd like to reach Coleman's Creek by nightfall." They remounted and continued their descent, the terrain gradually flattening as they approached the valley floor. The sun was low in the west when Everett suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. "What is it?" Harriet asked, tensing at his alert posture. He pointed silently ahead. Through the trees, Harriet could make out what appeared to be the remains of a campfire still smoldering. "Someone's been here recently," Everett said, his voice low. "Very recently." He dismounted, handing Midnight's reins to Harriet. "Stay here with the horses, I'm going to have a look." "Be careful," she whispered, suddenly afraid. Everett nodded, drawing his revolver before moving silently toward the campsite. Harriet watched him disappear among the trees, her heart pounding in her chest. Minutes stretched painfully as she waited, straining to hear any sound that might indicate danger. Finally, Everett reappeared, his expression grim. "3 men," he said. "Left in a hurry probably less than an hour ago. Looking for me, can't be sure," he admitted, "but they left tracks heading east toward Denver." He studied the darkening sky. "We need to change course again." "Head southeast instead of due east." "Will that take us to Denver?" "Eventually, but it'll add at least a day to our journey." He glanced at her. "I'm sorry," Harriet shook her head. "Better safe than sorry." They pushed on until full dark, making camp in a dense thicket that offered concealment but little comfort. Everett insisted on a cold camp, no fire that might attract attention, which meant a cheerless meal of jerky and hardtack washed down with water. As they prepared their bedrolls, Harriet noticed Everett wincing slightly as he moved. "Are you hurt?" she asked, concerned. He shook his head. "Old wound acts up sometimes, nothing serious. From the war, mm." He didn't elaborate, and Harriet didn't press. Instead, she reached for the tin of liniment he had given her days earlier. "Here," she said, offering it to him. "You said it helps." Everett looked at the tin, then at her, an unreadable expression crossing his face. "Thank you," he said finally, accepting it. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Harriet felt a small jolt at the contact. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Harriet found herself studying Everett's profile in the dim starlight. There was something about him that called to her a steadiness, a quiet strength that made her feel safe in a way she had never experienced before. But also something wounded, something guarded that stirred her compassion. What would happen, she wondered, when they reached Denver? Would he simply deliver her to Margaret's doorstep, tip his hat, and ride away? The thought created an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. Sometime during the night, it began to rain, a gentle patter at first, then increasing to a steady downpour that soaked through their blankets. Everett quickly helped Harriet gather their belongings and led her to a nearby outcropping of rock that offered minimal shelter. "Sorry about this," he said, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "Should have seen it coming." "It's hardly your fault," Harriet replied, huddling closer to the rock face. "You can't control the weather." They stood together in the cramped space, shoulders touching, as rain drummed on the ground around them. Harriet was acutely aware of Everett's proximity, of the solid warmth of him beside her in the darkness. "Tell me something about yourself," she said impulsively, seeking distraction from both the discomfort and her unsettling awareness of him. "Something I don't know yet," she felt rather than saw his surprise. "Like what? Anything. A memory, a dream, something you enjoy." He was silent for so long that Harriet thought he might not answer. Then, his voice soft in the darkness. "I like to carve, wood carving, learned it from my father." The horse on your bookshelf, Harriet realized. You made that. Yes, it helps me think, having something to do with my hands. A pause. Your turn. Harriet smiled, pleased that he was willing to play along. I used to sing before my parents died. My mother taught me. Are you any good? She thought so, Harriet replied. But mothers usually do. Sing something, Everett said, surprising her, now in the rain. She felt his shrug. Why not? No one to hear but me and the horses. Harriet hesitated, then softly began to sing a lullaby her mother had taught her. Her voice was rusty from disuse but gained strength as she continued. The simple melody seemed to blend with the rhythm of the rain, creating a moment of unexpected beauty in their uncomfortable situation. When she finished, there was silence except for the steady patter of raindrops. That was lovely, Everett said finally, his voice rough with some emotion she couldn't identify. Thank you, Harriet whispered, suddenly shy. They remained that way until dawn, talking softly in the darkness, sharing fragments of their lives. Harriet learned that Everett had a sweet tooth, that he had once dreamed of being a blacksmith like his father, that he had a gift for languages and could speak passable Spanish and Cheyenne. In turn, she told him about her love of Shakespeare, her childhood dream of traveling to Europe, her secret habit of writing stories that no one ever read. By the time the rain stopped and the first gray light of dawn appeared, Harriet felt as if something fundamental had shifted between them, some barrier lowered. Some distance crossed. When Everett helped her to her feet, his touch lingered a moment longer than necessary. We should get moving, he said, his voice gentle. Try to dry out as we ride. They traveled southeast that day, across rolling grassland dotted with occasional stands of trees. The weather cleared, bringing warm sunshine that gradually dried their damp clothing. By midday, Harriet's spirits had lifted considerably, despite the delay in their journey. There's a trading post about 5 miles ahead, Everett said as they crested a small rise. Lewis runs it. Good man, keeps to himself. We can resupply there. Is it safe? Harriet asked, adjusting her hat more firmly on her head. As safe as anywhere, Everett replied. And we need coffee. He glanced at her with a faint smile. Unless you want to keep drinking creek water. The trading post turned out to be a sturdy log building with a corral and stable attached. A sign above the door simply read Lewis Trading in faded paint. A few horses were tied up outside, suggesting other customers within. Stay close to me, Everett murmured as they dismounted. Let me do the talking, and keep your hat low. Harriet nodded, nervously adjusting her disguise. The borrowed clothes hung loosely on her frame, and with her short hair and hat, she hoped she could pass for a young man at casual glance. The interior of the trading post was dimly lit and crowded with merchandise shelves and barrels of supplies, tools hanging from rafters, stacks of furs and blankets. A burly man with a magnificent beard stood behind a rough-hewn counter, deep in conversation with 2 trail-worn cowboys. Everett guided Harriet toward a quieter corner of the store, where they pretended to examine canned goods while the cowboys concluded their business. Harriet kept her head down, heart pounding, acutely aware of how easily her disguise might be penetrated by someone looking closely. Finally, the cowboys departed with a jingle of spurs and Everett approached the counter. Lewis, he greeted the bearded man. Been a while. Marshall Holt, Lewis replied, his bushy eyebrows rising in surprise. Didn't expect to see you this far south. His gaze shifted to Harriet, curious but not suspicious. Tracking some stagecoach robbers, Everett said easily. Need to resupply, coffee mainly, some jerky if you've got it. Ammunition for a Colt .45. Lewis nodded, turning to gather the requested items. Heard about those robberies. Bad business. Any luck finding the gang? Following leads, Everett replied vaguely. My nephew here is helping me track them. First time in the field. Harriet kept her eyes lowered, hoping her burning cheeks wouldn't give her away. Good experience for the boy, Lewis commented, measuring coffee beans into a small sack. Learn from the best, eh? Everett paid for their supplies, exchanging a few more casual remarks with Lewis about weather and local news. As they turned to leave, the door swung open, admitting 3 men in trail-stained clothing. Harriet froze, recognizing one of them immediately Jenkins, one of the men who had been tracking her when Everett first found her. Everett's hand closed around her arm, his grip firm. Keep walking, he murmured, guiding her toward the door. Don't look up. They were almost past the newcomers when Jenkins glanced their way. Harriet held her breath, keeping her face averted, praying he wouldn't recognize her in her disguise. "Marshal Holt," Jenkins said, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you down this way." Everett paused, his expression neutral. "Jenkins, still riding for the Circle B?" "Yes, sir. Me and the boys are heading back from delivering a herd." Jenkins's gaze shifted to Harriet, curious but not suspicious. "Who's your companion?" "My sister's boy," Everett replied smoothly, "teaching him the ropes." Jenkins nodded, seeming to accept the explanation. "Well, good luck to you both." He moved past them toward the counter. Outside, Harriet released the breath she'd been holding. "That was close," she whispered once they were safely mounting their horses. "Too close," Everett agreed, his expression grim. "We need to move quickly if Jenkins mentions meeting me to anyone asking questions." They rode hard for the rest of the day, following a route that kept them away from established trails. By nightfall, both horses and riders were exhausted, but Everett insisted on continuing until they reached a secluded spot near a small creek. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said as they dismounted. "Then move on before dawn." Harriet nodded, too tired to argue. As she helped unsaddle the horses, she noticed Everett glancing frequently toward the way they had come, his expression tense. "Do you think they're following us?" she asked. "Not yet," he replied, "but Jenkins might put it together once he hears about a marshal traveling with a young nephew no one's heard of before." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Harriet had come to recognize as a sign of worry. "We're still at least a day and a half from Denver, maybe more depending on how careful we need to be." Harriet considered this. "What if we split up?" Everett looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "If they're looking for a marshal and his companion, they won't be looking for a woman traveling alone," she said, thinking aloud. "I could continue to Denver while you lead them in another direction." "Absolutely not," Everett said firmly. "It's too dangerous." "I've come this far," Harriet argued, "and I know the way now. With Penny I said no." His voice was harsher than she'd ever heard it. "I'm not leaving you to fend for yourself." The vehemence of his reaction startled her. "I'm not helpless, Everett." His expression softened slightly. "I know that, but my answer is still no." He turned away, effectively ending the discussion. They ate a cold supper in silence, the easy camaraderie of the previous night replaced by tension. Harriet knew Everett was right. Traveling alone would be dangerous, but his outright dismissal of her suggestion stung. She was no longer the sheltered young woman who had fled her uncle's house. These days on the trail had changed her, strengthened her. As they prepared their bedrolls, Everett finally broke the silence. "I didn't mean to speak harshly," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "but the thought of you alone out there." He shook his head. "I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you." The simple honesty of his words dissolved Harriet's lingering resentment. "I understand," she said softly, "and I'm sorry for suggesting it. We started this journey together. We'll finish it the same way." His gaze met hers then, something unspoken passing between them. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "I'll take first watch." Despite Everett's insistence that she rest, Harriet found sleep elusive. She lay awake, listening to the night sounds and watching Everett's silhouette as he sat sentinel at the edge of their small camp. There was something profoundly moving about his dedication to her safety, something that stirred emotions she wasn't sure how to name. When he finally woke her for her turn at watch, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten. "All quiet," he reported, settling onto his bedroll. "Wake me at full light," Harriet nodded, taking his place at the edge of camp. As she watched over his sleeping form, she found herself studying the lines of his face, softened now in repose. In sleep, he looked younger, the habitual wariness erased from his features. She wondered what it would be like to see him truly at peace, without the constant vigilance his life required. The thought brought with it a wave of longing so intense it startled her. Sometime during their journey, Everett Holt had become more than a protector to her. Much more. They broke camp at dawn, continuing southeast toward Denver. The day was clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Under different circumstances, it might have been a pleasant ride, but Everett's vigilance never wavered. He frequently checked their back trail and twice had them detour to avoid distant riders. By midday, his tension had communicated itself to Harriet, and she found herself jumping at every unexpected sound. How much further? She asked during a brief stop to water the horses. If we push hard, we could reach the outskirts of Denver by tomorrow afternoon, Everett replied, scanning the horizon. But we need to be careful. The closer we get, the more people we'll encounter. Harriet nodded, adjusting her hat. I'm ready. They remounted and continued their journey, the terrain gradually changing as they rode. The open grassland gave way to more varied landscape, with small farms and ranches appearing in the distance. Everett kept them away from established roads, choosing instead to follow creeks and the natural contours of the land. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Harriet noticed Everett becoming increasingly alert, frequently turning in his saddle to study the way they had come. What is it? She asked, guiding Penny alongside Midnight. Dust, he said grimly, pointing to a faint cloud on the horizon behind them. Riders moving fast. Harriet's heart sank. Following us? Maybe, maybe not. He studied the terrain ahead. We need cover. Somewhere to hide until they pass. They pushed the horses harder, scanning for any feature that might offer concealment. The land here was more open, with fewer stands of trees or rock formations. The dust cloud behind them grew more distinct. There, Everett said suddenly, pointing to a cluster of abandoned buildings barely visible in the distance. Looks like an old mining camp, might give us cover. They rode toward it at a gallop, the horses sensing their riders' urgency. As they drew closer, Harriet could make out several dilapidated structures, a small cabin, what might have been a bunkhouse, and the skeletal remains of what looked like a mine entrance. Abandoned silver mine, Everett explained as they approached. Played out years ago. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses behind the largest building. Everett tied them securely, then drew his rifle from its scabbard. Stay here with the horses, he instructed. I'll check the buildings. While he was gone, Harriet peered anxiously toward the dust cloud. It was definitely closer now, the riders more distinct. She counted at least 5, maybe more. Everett returned moments later. Cabin's secure, he reported. We'll hide the horses in the old bunkhouse and ourselves in the cabin, has the best view of the approaches. They worked quickly, moving the horses into the crumbling bunkhouse and covering their tracks as best they could. Then they hurried to the cabin, a single-room structure with boarded windows and a sagging roof. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface, and the air inside was stale. Perfect, Everett muttered. No one's been here in years. He positioned himself at a gap in the boarded windows, rifle ready. Harriet stood beside him, peering through another gap. The riders were clearly visible now, approaching at a steady pace. Can you see who they are? She whispered. Everett raised his spyglass. 3 men I don't recognize, he reported, and he broke off, his expression hardening. Your uncle and Edgar Donovan. Harriet's blood ran cold. They found us. Maybe, maybe not. Everett's voice was calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw. They could be passing through. Stay quiet and let's see. The riders drew nearer, then slowed as they approached the abandoned buildings. Harriet held her breath, watching as her uncle, a portly man with thinning hair and florid features, gestured toward the structures. The men spread out, clearly intending to search. They know we're here, Everett said softly, or at least suspect it. He turned to Harriet, his expression grave. I want you to slip out the back way, head for the mine entrance. There's an old tunnel that might lead to the other side of the hill. What about you? Harriet asked, fear clutching at her throat. I'll keep them busy here, he replied. Give you time to get away. No, she said firmly. I'm not leaving you to face them alone. Everett's expression softened. Harriet, no, she repeated. We stay together. Before he could argue further, a voice called from outside. We know you're in there, Marshall. Come out and bring the girl. Everett's jaw tightened. That's Jenkins. Must have figured out who you were. He moved away from the window, considering their options. Back door, he decided, quietly. We'll try to reach the horses. They crept toward the rear of the cabin, but before they could reach the door, a shot rang out, splintering the wood near Everett's head. He shoved Harriet down as more shots followed. They've got us surrounded, he muttered, returning fire through a gap in the boards. Stay low. Harriet's heart pounded as bullets thudded into the cabin walls. Everett moved from window to window, firing strategically, making each shot count. Marshall Holt. It was her uncle's voice now, pompous even in pursuit. This is none of your concern. The girl is my ward, and she's coming home with me. Your ward is a grown woman who doesn't want to marry your friend Donovan, Everett called back. "Walk away, Foster." A different voice answered colder, more controlled. "The lady made a commitment, Marshal. I expect her to honor it." "A commitment made under duress isn't binding," Everett replied, reloading his rifle. "In case you've forgotten, forcing a woman into marriage is against the law in this territory." A harsh laugh answered him. "Laws are for those without the means to circumvent them." The exchange gave Harriet a sudden, desperate idea. "The chimney," she whispered to Everett. "I might be able to climb it, create a distraction while you get to the horses." Everett looked at her in disbelief. "It's too dangerous." "No more dangerous than sitting here waiting for them to rush the cabin," she argued. "I'm smaller than you, I can fit." He hesitated, clearly torn between the risk to her and the diminishing options they faced. Finally, he nodded. "Be careful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll cover you." Harriet crawled to the stone fireplace, peering up the chimney. It was narrow but appeared intact, with enough irregularities in the stonework to provide handholds. Taking a deep breath, she began to climb, bracing herself against the sooty walls. The ascent was harder than she'd anticipated. Twice she nearly lost her grip, sending small cascades of soot and debris down into the fireplace. But determination drove her upward, inch by painful inch, until finally she reached the top. Cautiously, she peered over the edge of the chimney. From this vantage point, she could see the men surrounding the cabin, her uncle and Donovan hanging back, while Jenkins and two others maintained their positions with rifles trained on the doors and windows. No one was looking up. Harriet pulled herself completely out of the chimney and crawled across the sagging roof to the edge. There, she took a deep breath and let out the loudest scream she could muster. The effect was immediate. All heads whipped toward her, momentarily forgetting the cabin doors. Seizing the opportunity, Everett burst through the back door, firing rapidly to drive the nearest men to cover. "Run!" he shouted to Harriet as he sprinted toward the bunkhouse where the horses were hidden. Harriet scrambled down from the roof as quickly as she dared, dropping the last few feet to the ground with a jarring impact. She ran toward the bunkhouse, aware of shouts and gunfire behind her. Everett had already freed the horses and was mounted on Midnight, holding Penny's reins. "Hurry!" he called, extending his hand to her. Harriet reached for him, but at that moment, a shot rang out and she felt a searing pain along her upper arm. She stumbled, crying out involuntarily. Everett was off Midnight in an instant, scooping her up with one arm while firing his revolver with the other. He practically threw her onto Penny's saddle, then vaulted onto Midnight. "Ride," he commanded, and they galloped away from the abandoned mine, bullets kicking up dust at their horses' heels. They rode hard, following a dry creek bed that offered some cover from their pursuers. Harriet's arm throbbed, blood seeping through the torn sleeve of her shirt, but she gritted her teeth and kept pace with Everett. Only when they had put several miles between themselves and the mine did Everett signal a halt, guiding them into a dense thicket of cottonwoods beside a small stream. "Let me see your arm," he said, dismounting quickly and moving to help her from Penny's saddle. Harriet winced as he gently rolled up her sleeve, revealing a bloody furrow across her upper arm. "Just a graze," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Still needs cleaning," Everett replied, his face grim. He led her to the stream where he bathed the wound carefully before binding it with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. His fingers were gentle against her skin, belying the anger she could see in the tight set of his jaw. "I'm sorry," he said as he secured the makeshift bandage. "I should have protected you better." "You did protect me," Harriet insisted. "We both made it out alive." He looked at her then, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "When I saw you hit, I thought," he broke off, shaking his head. "Never mind, we need to keep moving. They won't give up easily." But Harriet caught his hand before he could rise. "What did you think, Everett?" For a long moment, he simply looked at her, conflict evident in his eyes. Then, with a gentleness that took her breath away, he raised his free hand to her cheek. "I thought I might lose you," he said softly, "and I realized I couldn't bear that." Harriet's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "Why?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer, had known it, perhaps, since that night in the rain when they had shared stories in the darkness. Instead of replying, Everett leaned forward and kissed her a tender, questioning kiss that seemed to ask permission even as it was granted. Harriet responded without hesitation, her uninjured arm coming up to circle his neck. When they finally parted, Everett rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't plan this," he murmured. "Didn't expect to feel this way again, not after Catherine." "I know," Harriet replied, her voice equally soft. "I didn't expect it either." He drew back slightly, studying her face. "We still need to get you to Denver, to safety." And then, a smile gentle, uncertain but real touched his lips. "And then, if you're willing, perhaps we could see what might grow between us." Harriet returned his smile, feeling a lightness in her heart despite the danger still pursuing them. "I'd like that," she said simply. They rested only briefly before continuing their journey, aware that their pursuers wouldn't be far behind. Harriet's arm ached, but the pain was manageable, and the memory of Everett's kiss seemed to give her renewed strength. They rode through the night, following the stars, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers, but Everett remained vigilant. "Denver's less than 20 miles now," he said as they paused to water the horses at a small creek. "We should reach it by afternoon." Harriet nodded, trying to ignore the conflicting emotions the news stirred within her. Safety beckoned, yet reaching Denver would mean the end of their journey together. Despite Everett's words, she couldn't help but wonder what would truly happen once she was delivered to her cousin's doorstep. Would he really stay? Or would duty call him back to his solitary life as a marshal? As if sensing her thoughts, Everett moved to stand beside her at the creek's edge. "Penny for your thoughts," he said quietly. Harriet smiled at the familiar phrase. "I was thinking about Denver," she admitted. "About what happens next." Everett nodded, his expression serious. "Your uncle and Donovan won't give up easily. They'll likely follow us into the city." "I'm not afraid of them," Harriet said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Not anymore. No." Everett raised an eyebrow. "Why is that?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because I'm not alone anymore." Something warm flickered in his eyes. He reached out, tucking a strand of her short hair behind her ear. "No," he agreed softly. "You're not." They mounted up and continued their journey, the terrain gradually changing as they approached the city. Small farms gave way to more densely settled areas, and by early afternoon, they could see Denver sprawling ahead of them in the distance. "We should find you more appropriate clothing before we reach your cousin's home," Everett said as they approached the outskirts of the city. "A young woman arriving in men's attire might raise questions we'd rather avoid." Harriet glanced down at her borrowed clothes, now dusty and blood-stained. "Yes, I suppose you're right." They stopped at a small general store on the edge of town, where Everett purchased a simple dress and shawl for Harriet. The shopkeeper's wife provided a small back room where Harriet could change, exclaiming over her short hair, but asking no questions when Everett introduced her as his sister recovering from a fever. Looking at herself in the cracked mirror after changing, Harriet hardly recognized the woman who stared back at her. The dress was plain but clean, emphasizing her slender figure. Her short hair, once shocking, now seemed to suit her face, giving her an appearance of independence that the old Harriet would never have dared. She emerged from the back room to find Everett waiting, his expression softening as he took in her transformed appearance. "Better?" she asked, suddenly shy under his gaze. "Different," he replied with a faint smile, "but still you." They continued into Denver, now looking like any other couple arriving in the city after a journey. Harriet directed them toward the fashionable neighborhood where her cousin lived, based on the address from the intercepted letter. Margaret's home turned out to be a handsome two-story house with a neat garden and wrought iron fence. Harriet hesitated at the gate, suddenly nervous. What if Margaret didn't remember her offer? What if she turned them away? Everett seemed to sense her uncertainty. "I'll be right beside you," he said quietly. Taking a deep breath, Harriet pushed open the gate and walked up the path to the front door. Before she could knock, the door swung open, revealing a woman in her 30s with Harriet's same blonde hair and similar features. "Can I help you?" the woman asked politely. "Margaret," Harriet said, her voice wavering slightly. "It's Harriet Foster, your cousin." Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "Harriet, is it really you?" Her gaze moved from Harriet's face to her short hair, then to Everett standing protectively at her side. "What on earth happened to you?" "It's a rather long story," Harriet admitted. "May we come in?" Margaret stepped aside immediately. Of course, please, both of you. They were ushered into a comfortable parlor where Margaret rang for tea and listened with increasing horror as Harriet explained everything: her uncle's gambling debts, Donovan's proposal, her flight, and Everett's intervention. "That dreadful man," Margaret exclaimed when Harriet had finished. "I always knew Jeremiah was selfish, but to try to marry you off to pay his debts, it's unconscionable." She turned to Everett, gratitude in her eyes. "Marshal Holt, I cannot thank you enough for protecting my cousin." Everett shifted uncomfortably under her praise. "Just doing what was right, madam. Nevertheless, you have my deepest thanks." Margaret turned back to Harriet. "You will stay here, of course, for as long as you wish. This is your home now." Tears sprang to Harriet's eyes at her cousin's immediate acceptance. "Thank you, Margaret. I was hoping you might still remember your offer." "Of course I do. I've written to you several times over the years, but never received a reply. Now I understand why." Margaret's expression hardened. "If Jeremiah shows his face in Denver, he'll regret it. My husband is quite influential in the city council." As they spoke, Harriet was acutely aware of Everett's silence. He sat slightly apart from them, his expression neutral, but she could sense his withdrawal. The journey was over. His duty fulfilled. The thought brought an ache to her chest that even Margaret's warm welcome couldn't dispel. When the tea was finished, Everett rose to his feet. "I should be going," he said formally. "Make sure you're not followed to the city." Margaret protested. "Surely you'll stay for dinner at least. It's the least we can do." "Thank you, madam, but I should report to the local sheriff's office about your brother-in-law and his companion." He turned to Harriet, his expression softening slightly. "You'll be safe here." Harriet nodded, unable to trust her voice. Was this goodbye, then? After everything they had shared, "I'll see you to the door," she managed finally, rising to her feet in the entrance hall away from Margaret's curious eyes. Harriet turned to face Everett. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything?" He nodded, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing it. "You're welcome. Will you?" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Will you come back after you've spoken to the sheriff?" Something flickered in his expression, hope, perhaps, or uncertainty. "Do you want me to?" "Yes," Harriet said simply. "Very much." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "Then I'll come back," he promised. Impulsively, Harriet rose on her tiptoes and pressed a kiss to his cheek. "I'll be waiting." As she watched him ride away, Harriet felt not the sadness of farewell, but the anticipation of a beginning. Whatever came next, she knew with absolute certainty that Everett Holt would return to her, and when he did, they would face it together. True to his word, Everett returned that evening, having spoken with the Denver sheriff about Jeremiah Foster and Edgar Donovan. The sheriff had agreed to keep an eye out for the men and to inform them if they appeared in the city. Margaret welcomed him warmly to dinner, where Harriet was delighted to discover that her cousin's husband, Richard, was as kind and welcoming as Margaret herself. Over the meal, conversation flowed easily, with Richard expressing interest in Everett's work as a marshal and offering his assistance should it be needed. "The city council has some influence with the territorial governor," Richard explained. "If your superiors give you any trouble over helping Harriet, I'd be happy to put in a good word." "I appreciate that," Everett replied, "though I expect they'll understand once I explain the circumstances." After dinner, while Margaret and Richard retired to the parlor, Harriet and Everett slipped out to the garden. The evening was warm, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Your cousin and her husband seem like good people," Everett observed as they walked along a gravel path between flowering shrubs. "They are," Harriet agreed. "I'm fortunate that Margaret remembered me, that she still wanted to help after all these years." "Family should look out for each other," Everett said. "Real family, not people like your uncle." They reached a small bench beneath a flowering cherry tree and sat down, close enough that their shoulders touched. For a moment, they simply enjoyed the peaceful evening, so different from the dangerous days of their journey. "What happens now?" Harriet asked finally. "With your assignment, I mean, the stagecoach robbers." "I'll continue tracking them," Everett replied. "But first, I need to make sure your uncle and Donovan have truly given up. I don't trust them to simply accept defeat." Harriet nodded, having expected as much. "How long will you stay in Denver?" Everett turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "That depends," he said quietly. On you?" He took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. On what you want. Harriet's heart quickened at his touch. What if I want you to stay, not just for a few days, but longer? A smile touched his lips. Then I'd need to have a serious conversation with the marshal's office about reassignment to the Denver district. Is that possible? Possible, yes. His smile widened. Especially with the city council's support. Hope bloomed in Harriet's chest. And what about after the stagecoach robbers are caught? After my uncle gives up his pursuit? Everett's expression grew more serious. That depends on something else entirely. What? Instead of answering immediately, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving, a delicate rose, expertly crafted, with each petal distinct and perfect. I made this while you were getting settled with your cousin, he said, placing it in her palm. Not my usual subject, but it made me think of you. Harriet stared at the tiny rose, touched beyond words by the gift and what it represented. It's beautiful, she whispered. Harriet, Everett said, his voice low and earnest. I know we've only known each other a short time. And I know you've just escaped one unwanted engagement. The last thing I want is to pressure you into anything. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But these past days with you, they've changed me, reminded me that there's more to life than just duty and survival. Harriet looked up from the carving to meet his eyes. They've changed me too, she said softly. Shown me that I'm stronger than I knew, that I can face danger and overcome it. She took a deep breath. That I can love and be loved in return. Everett's eyes widened at her words. Harriet, are you saying? I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Everett Holt, she interrupted, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. And that whatever happens next, I want us to face it together. For a moment, he simply stared at her, wonder in his expression. Then, with gentle hands, he cupped her face and kissed her a kiss filled with promise and longing and joy. I love you too, he murmured when they finally parted. More than I thought possible. They remained in the garden until the stars were fully out, planning their future together. Everett would request reassignment to Denver while they ensured Harriet's safety from her uncle. They would court properly or as properly as a former runaway bride and a frontier marshal could manage, and when the time was right, they would marry. Not because anyone is forcing us, Harriet said firmly, but because we choose each other. Always, Everett agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. In the months that followed, life unfolded in ways Harriet could never have predicted. Her uncle made one attempt to confront her in Denver, only to be firmly turned away by the local sheriff, backed by Richard's influence and Everett's watchful presence. Edgar Donovan, faced with the loss of both his prospective bride and the debt Jeremiah owed him, eventually returned east, reportedly to seek an heiress in Boston instead. Everett successfully captured the stagecoach robbery gang, earning commendation from his superiors and securing his requested transfer to Denver. He took rooms not far from Margaret and Richard's home, calling on Harriet nearly every day when not required for his duties. Harriet herself flourished in Denver. With Margaret's encouragement, she began teaching at a small school for girls, finding joy in sharing her love of literature and history with eager young minds. Her hair grew out somewhat, though she kept it shorter than fashion dictated, preferring the freedom and simplicity of the style. As autumn painted the mountains in golds and reds, Everett took Harriet riding outside the city, returning to the kind of open country where they had first come to know each other. There, beside a clear mountain stream with aspen leaves shimmering overhead, he knelt and formally asked for her hand in marriage. Not because you need my protection, he said, holding out a simple gold ring, but because I love you and want to build a life with you. Harriet's answer was an emphatic yes. They were married in December, in a small ceremony at Margaret and Richard's home. Harriet wore a gown of deep blue instead of traditional white, a choice that raised some eyebrows but felt right to her. Everett, resplendent in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him. I never thought I'd be this happy again, he whispered as they exchanged vows. Nor I, Harriet replied, her heart full to bursting. Their first home together was a small but comfortable house on the outskirts of Denver, close enough to the city for convenience, but with open country nearby for riding. Everett continued his work as a marshal, though with less dangerous assignments now that he had a wife waiting for his return. Harriet divided her time between teaching and creating a warm, welcoming home one very different from the cold, oppressive atmosphere of her uncle's house. In the spring, they planted a garden together, with special care given to a bush of wild roses similar to the one Everett had carved for her that night in Margaret's garden. And when summer came again, bringing the anniversary of their first meeting, they celebrated by retracing part of their original journey, this time without pursuers at their heels. "Do you ever regret it?" Everett asked as they camped beside a familiar creek. "Running away that night." "All the danger you faced." Harriet shook her head, smiling at her husband across the small campfire. "Never, it led me to you." In the years that followed, their family grew first with the arrival of their daughter Catherine, named for the woman Everett had loved and lost, and later with twins, a boy and girl they called Thomas and Elizabeth. Their home expanded too, as did their circle of friends and the respect they commanded in the community. Everett eventually left the Marshal Service to become Denver's chief of police, a position that kept him closer to home and allowed him more time with his family. Harriet continued teaching until their children were born, then channeled her love of stories into writing first articles for the local newspaper, then eventually novels about the frontier that found an eager audience back east. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and they had the night to themselves, they would sometimes sit on their porch and gaze at the stars, remembering that fateful night when a desperate young woman had whispered, "I can cook, mister," and a lonely lawman had replied, "You don't have to, but you can stay." Two simple sentences that had changed their lives forever. In time, the story became family legend told and retold to their children and eventually their grandchildren. How Harriet had fled an unwanted marriage and found true love on the dangerous frontier. How Everett had rescued her only to discover that she had, in her way, rescued him as well from a life of solitude and duty without joy. "The best decision I ever made," Everett would say, his eyes still holding the same warmth when he looked at Harriet, even after decades together. "Which one?" Their grandchildren would ask. "Letting her stay," he would reply, reaching for Harriet's hand. "Letting her into my life, into my heart." And Harriet, her hand in his, would smile and add, "And the best decision I ever made was trusting him. Trusting that there was a man in this world who would value my choices, my freedom, my love." Together, they had built a life neither could have imagined that night beside a creek in the wilderness. A life of love and family, of challenges overcome and joys shared. A life that had begun with danger and desperation, but blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. A love story written across the wild frontier of Wyoming territory, as vast and true as the land itself.